Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. And allow me to share with you our brand new topic, the first ever presented to the public, though I've been studying and writing about Kafka for years. He is the hero of one of my essays in the book, The Tao of Being Jewish, but putting together understanding Czech Jewish narrative through the mind of the greatest of modernist authors, it's a beginning. I hope that you will be as much excited about this topic as myself and my husband, Alex, and we'll begin. So, why Kafka? Some of you who I know within the audience were asking me about that, because I talk about so many different Jewish narratives about little known, unknown communities all over the world, and about European, like Central European, Eastern European Jewish stories. Why modernist writer appears here? There are few reasons. And few of them are from the point of view of a historian and a researcher. Franz Kafka was an archetypal intellectual of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the beginning of the 20th century. He was a Prague Jew whose Jewish identity was very fluid and very complex. And right now is the area of a minor scholarship, minor but very crowded and very exciting, about the Jewish identity of the people who lived in the kingdom of Bohemia and Moravia, about Czech Jews. Kafka personified a new emerging European phenomenon, and that of a secular Jew. That's why it's so important for what we will be talking about today. He considered himself German, and German considered his native language. Unknown in his lifetime, Kafka became one of the greatest and most influential European writers after the Second World War. Even before the end of the 1930s, he was already translated in multiple languages and was talked about as the greatest contemporary writer at that time, in the same breath as T.S. Eliot or James Joyce or Marcel Proust or Thomas Mann. And there is also a very personal reason. In my generation, myself and my closest friends, we discovered Kafka in the 1970s while still in school, in high school, in the former Soviet Union. And all of us, who read it, discussed Kafka between ourselves, we were swept away and overwhelmed by the turbulence of his stories. And we often wondered how on earth Kafka was allowed, how Kafka was even translated in the bleak and depressing world of Brezhnev's USSR. His world was the one of oppressive reality, bizarre life changes. This world was filled with endless struggle with mindless, invisible authority and absurd bureaucracy. And that's the world we knew very well. And think about it, Kafka is the only writer whose name came into language in a way that nobody else's did. The term Kafkaesque, we thought, described our life in the Soviet Union. What we mean by Kafkaesque is mindless, not understandable, bizarre changes in your destiny, hopeless situations. But I found analysis of the Kafkaesque meaning in one of my most favorite books about Kafka, written by Friedrich Karl, Kafka, Representative Man, Prague, Germans, Jews, and the Crisis of Modernism. I think Kafkaesque as a term is as much used as it misused. I remember standing in a bus stop in Upper West Side in New York, and very angry man said, well, this bus was supposed to be here 30 minutes ago. That's Kafkaesque. Well, it is not. So that was what Friedrich Karl says. Kafka, just imagine that you enter a surreal world in which all your control patterns, all your plans, the whole way in which you have configured your own behavior, everything begins to fall into pieces. And you find yourself against a force that does not lend itself to the way you perceive your world. So what happened? You don't give up, you don't lie down and die, you do struggle against this force. You use everything you have, but of course you don't stand a chance. That's Kafkaesque. Kafkaesque, he says, defines us. It is one word that tells us what we are, what we can expect, how our world works. And to find out what that means, you read Kafka. Just read the Metamorphoses. Veronica, it probably was the book you read while in college, which is about a man who wakes up as a big ugly bug, and then you know. So, unlike many characters in Kafka's stories, we were lucky, we were able to leave this world behind, and in the early 1980s, arrived in Cleveland, immigrated to America. When the Soviet hold on the entire Eastern Bloc came to the end, then the road to Kafka for us, our readers, our followers of his stories for over 40 years was finally open. So our road to Prague and the Czech lands was 40 years in the making. And that road for us went through Kafka's books and his intellectual universe. So the load we carried, the contents of my backpacks that I brought to Prague, in addition to a few items of clothing that Alex found too excessive in numbers, I had quite a few books by Kafka. Metamorphoses, just to remind you, was one of the very, very few works published during Kafka's lifetime. You know that at his deathbed, his wish was to burn everything, not to publish everything, not the letters, not the articles, nothing. And thankfully for us, his readers, his followers, his admirers, his closest friend, Max Brod, published everything he could find. So Metamorphoses was published during Kafka's life. And in this story, a salesman named Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning and finds himself transformed into a huge insect. And he struggles to adjust to his new condition. The second book that I really loved very much back in the Soviet Union, The Trial. It's a novel written about the same time that Metamorphoses, but was published by Max Brod only after Kafka's death. And another character, he does not have first name and last name, just the first name, Joseph, and instead of last name, initial K. He wakes up one morning, just like Gregor Samsa, and finds two guys sitting in his breakfast room. They represent some unnamed authority and inform him that he's arrested and prosecuted for some terrible crimes that he never committed. And the nature of this crime is never disclosed neither to us readers nor to Joseph K. Another book was The Penal Colony. There, unnamed men, no names, come to unnamed island, we don't know which one, to visit unnamed penal colony and to observe the terrible mechanism of torture and execution. And this is a machine that carves the sentence in the flesh of the accused, of the convict. And of course, the person dies within 12 hours. Another one, the novel that we brought in was, and all his novels are very short stories called The Castle. And this is about the man who does not have a first name, does not have a last name, it's just initial K. He is suddenly summoned to come to the village to appear in the castle. This huge, intimidating presence that I know there are people who been to Prague or come from Prague. It's like castle or cathedral quarter for me in Prague, intimidating presence. So he comes to the village, he tries to get to the castle, he cannot. So he waits and waits, and he gets old and he's dying. And when he's on his deathbed, let me find the quote, because he receives, he received the note that we now find your claims that you were called to come to the castle. It's illegal, but we allow you to live in the village, even that you have no right to do so. So that's how he dies. And now we're ready to, with Kafka, to explore a Jewish narrative of the Czech lands. When we talk about the Czech lands, we include the modern Czech Republic, as well as Bohemia, Czech Silesia, and Moravia. And the history of Jews there goes back for many, many centuries, over thousands of years. And we know that from different evidences, the first Jewish tourist or traveler there was a Jewish man, Abraham ben Yaakov, who was an envoy in the service of the Caliph of Cordoba. And he documented flourishing Jewish presence in Bohemia and Moravia at the end of the 10th century. By the 11th century, the community was already well established. Well, and they didn't have it easy. It was Kafkaesque twist in every turn, starting with Crusaders. In 1096, instead of going to Jerusalem, Crusaders decided to stop in Prague and have themselves a little fun of killing the Jews. So Jewish Prague was razed to the ground. Next century, 1179, the church announced that Christians should avoid touching the Jews. So they officially identified the Jews as the others. It was the beginning of Jewish ghetto, and that's how it was going. In the 1300s, Charles IV, the first Prague, the first Czech king who became Holy Roman Emperor, he allows the gentry, the landed gentry, not to pay back money they owe to the Jews. But then situation gradually began to change with the Habsburgs. But first I wanted to mention to you and remind you that in Europe, anti-Semitism is literally cut in stone, and it's deeply embedded in Western culture. In this slide, you can see on the right, the so-called Jewish pig. It's 700-old relic, and it's still displayed in the facade of the town church in Wittenberg in Germany. You can see men identified as Jews sucking the pig, and the man who is probably a rabbi looking under its tail. Well, there was a movement in Germany, in Wittenberg and in other cities, small group of people, they filed the case in the federal court saying that this sculpture represents an insult and defamation to Jewish people. It should be removed and placed in the museum dedicated to life of Martin Luther. Well, they were refused. On the left, you see the typical blood libel that survived through thousands of years. It's in Palazzo Salvador in Trent, Italy, and represents little baby Simon of Trent, who is still the saint, who supposedly was killed by the Jews because they used his blood for making matzah. Czech Jews under the Habsburgs, that's quite a story. In 1501, the king of the Czech language becomes the first Habsburg, Ferdinand I. And probably because he was so busy with integration of new lands into the Habsburg's empire, the Jews were allowed to do whatever they wanted. There were no restrictions. So economy, finance flourished, trade flourished, but also this age in the beginning of the 1500s is considered to be Prague Renaissance. Prague ghetto became the center of Jewish mysticism. Artisans, intellectuals came from all over Europe and congregated in Prague. A number of Jews became not just theologians or Talmud scholars, but mathematicians, astronomers, geographers, historians, philosophers, artists. They took part in Renaissance. From 1520 to 1540, the population of Prague almost doubled because many Jewish refugees who were expelled from Spain, Portugal, Austria, Germany, Moravia, they came to Prague. The Jewish quarter officially became Jewish ghetto and the center of Prague Renaissance. The ghetto even expanded because Jews were allowed to acquire adjacent land and to build their houses. Then Ferdinand I decided he had enough of these Jews and he expelled them from Prague. Entire history goes through a very short period of blossoming and freedom that seemed unreal to pogrom after pogrom, expulsion, pogrom, expulsion. It's almost like in Kafka. Unanticipated twist, a bizarre twist of fate. Ferdinand expelled the Jews when they had to pack up and went to countryside, not for long. It was shorter than usual, was just 24 years, because then Rudolf II crowned as Czech king, another Habsburg. He was a strange guy. He was considered a weak leader. He had no interest for Catholicism or Catholic counter-reformation in his empire. He had strange habits, like he collected short people, and he had a high number of them at his court. And he also had a special regiment just for very tall people, for the giants. But in addition to collecting dwarf and giants, he was very interested in not religion, but not even in governing, but in mathematics, astronomy, philosophy. And he regularly invited rabbis from Jewish ghetto to come and talk to him about Kabbalah, about mysticism. So this is a golden period in Prague Jewish history. First press, Hebrew press was in Prague, first in Europe. First book in Hebrew in Central Europe was printed in Prague. And there, Prague Passover Haggadah became model in Europe for subsequent Haggadot. Now we can jump to the 18th century, to the famous and one of the greatest rulers of Europe, Maria Theresa. She was a very talented ruler. Now, she is considered one of the greatest European rulers. At the same time, she is well known for her hatred of the Jews, especially in 1772, first partition of Poland. She wakes up that morning and she is told that there are hundreds of thousands of Jews joined her empire. Oi, wait, what can she do? She's writes Familien's law. According to these laws, only one son in Jewish family had permission to marry and have children, enough with these Jews. Her son was a different matter. Joseph II, he was considered an Enlightenment ruler, Enlightenment tyrant here, with a joke said about himself. He considered and he announced the Jews are useful subjects to the crown, and he published his groundbreaking Edict of Tolerance in 1782 that integrates minorities, including the Jews, into the larger society, gives them freedom of worship. He allows to build new synagogues. But, and what else? He directs that headers, Jewish schools would have secular subjects, absolutely teach secular subjects in religious schools, and everything should be only in German. Jews could go into different professions. They could study in universities with a small caveat. If university graduated Jew did not want to be baptized, there were only two professions he could take, and it would be law or medicine. And we will talk about it when we come to Franz Kafka. But what Joseph II did for the Jews, they were extremely grateful. And they named the Jewish ghetto, Jewish quarter in Prague, called Josephov. So every one of you who visited it, you knew it was Josephov, and it's named after Joseph II. The last emperor of Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Kafka, named after him. Jews enjoyed an unprecedented prosperity and equal rights. In 1867, he signed the law that civil rights and the country policy are not contingent on people's religion. He visited Jerusalem on numerous occasions. He supported Jewish institutions. He even funded a couple of Talmudic schools for rabbis. In 1895, Judaism and Christianity were put on the same footing. They became equal religion. So many Jews named their sons after Franz Joseph. And of course, everything that was happening with given the freedom, emancipation of the Jews caused hatred and anti-Semitism and numerous pogroms in Prague. So what was going on? Emancipation or secularization? What was the national identity of the Jews of Bohemia? This area of scholarship becomes so attractive to a number of historians because of the complexity and fluidity of identities. Competing national identifications. Are you German or you're Austrian, or you're Jewish? And if you're Jewish, you're German Jewish, or you're Czech Jewish, you're Zionist, or you atheist. So we're looking at few phenomena happening at the same time. German identity. In the 1890s, most Czech Jews were German-speaking and considered themselves German. Urbanization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thousands and thousands of Jews came to Prague from small villages and towns of Bohemia. And most Jews lived in large cities like in Prague or in Brno. And if Jews constitute less than 1% of the entire population in Austro-Hungarian Empire, in Prague and in Brno, it was 4.2%. Secularism. The interwar Jewish population became increasingly not only urban, but also secular. And there was a steep decline in religious observance in the 19th century there, and most Bohemian Jews became absolutely ambivalent to religion. Intermarriages. There were more intermarriages in Bohemia than anywhere else in Europe. Over almost 44% of Jews married what was considered to be out of phase. And on this slide, you can see the photo of 19th century photo of a typical observant Jewish man from Prague and young Franz Kafka. The anti-Semitism was considered to be in much lesser degree in Prague or in Bohemia than in anywhere else in Europe. But as Franz Kafka wrote to his friends, I walk along the streets, and it was 1918 when this letter was written. I walk along the streets and I bathe in anti-Semitism. There were pogroms, there were beatings and even killings in the streets and in Jewish quarters. Parashiva plemeno, filthy race, I have heard the Jews referred to. And Prague had its own Dreyfus. In 1899, Jewish man Leopold Hilsner was accused and convicted of ritual murder of Czech woman during Passover. Why? He needed her blood, you see, for making his matzah. But among his defenders was the Emperor Franz Joseph himself. And, after World War I, Austro-Hungarian Empire stops to exist, it falls into pieces, and new Czech Republic was born, 1918. So the first president, founder of new Czech Republic, Tomáš Masaryk, he was a defender of Leopold Hilsner, but nevertheless, Hilsner spent 17 miserable years in prison. It's interesting, I came across an old reprint in old newspaper articles when journalists asked Tomáš Masaryk about anti-Semitism. They asked him, did you overcome anti-Semitism that's so prevalent among the population? And you know what he said? Emotionally, no, but intellectually, yes. So what happened during the Holocaust, I'm sure you know very well. And in this map, you can see the borders of Czechoslovakia before Hitler, and then the lands that were annexed by Hitler in 1938. And as soon as Czech Republic came under Hitler, their fate was absolutely, it's already was done. Slovakia joined the Axis, and it was the first Axis partner to consent to deportation of the Jews. So the Germans and their collaborators killed approximately 263,000 Jews. Only 26,000 were able to immigrate before the start of World War II. So let's visit Josefov in Prague. It's Jewish history with a typical Kafkaesque twist. The reason when you go to Prague, whether you're Jewish or not, everybody visits Josefov and sees all these beautiful synagogues. Entire complex is called Jewish Museum of Prague. And the reason these synagogues were let to live, they were preserved in all their ancient beauty, was because Hitler, for some reason, decided that this ghetto in Prague would be exotic museum of degenerate and extinguished race. How about Kafka? So when you there, you visit one synagogue after another. And here you see the Pinkas synagogue, 500-year-old synagogue that now is not active house of worship, but is a memorial to almost 80,000 Czech and Moravian Jews who were victims to the Shoah. What I wanted to tell you is that during the Soviet domination in Eastern Europe and in Czechoslovakia, most of these synagogues were closed and came into disrepair. Only after Prague Spring, only after 1968, they were restored and became either museums or functioning synagogues. There is memorial to the Jewish victims here with the names of people and the list of concentration camps where they perished. And I recently found a curious story. It was, I think, in the World of Israel or Times of Israel, the return to the Pinkas synagogue stolen Torah scroll. The Nazis stole the scroll from Pinkas synagogue. For some reason, it ended up after the war in private hands, was sold in different auctions, and ended up at the Memorial Scrolls Trust based in London, UK. So it was returned to Prague, but not to Pinkas synagogue. That's not active synagogue, it's a museum, but to the new synagogue that was open in September 2020 at Chaim's congregation. It's a progressive or liberal synagogue. And this scroll was used for in 2021 Simchat Torah celebration in last September. Now back to Josefov, a ceremonial hall, which was a mortuary, the place where the dead were prepared for burial. And now it's a museum of different ritual objects like this one or Torahs that were saved by the Nazis for us to see today. Old Jewish cemetery that started probably in 1200s and lasted and was used through the end of the 17th, so even 18th century. That's how it looks. That's where you visit the dead Jews of Prague. To the left, you see the tomb of Rabbi Avigdor Kara. Remember, we talk about turns and twists of fate for the Jews of Bohemia, the Czech Jews. In 1389, Prague priests spread the rumor that Jews desecrated the host, this wafers that use during Mass for Holy Communion. And of course, mob was inspired, rushed to Jewish quarter and kill everybody they inside or force people to convert. Practically entire Jewish population was murdered, over 3,000 people with only few survivors. One of them was a young man who then became a rabbi, Avigdor Kara. And as you notice when you visit Prague, the past there is always present. In 1389, Rabbi Kara wrote a moving elegy describing this attack. And it's read in every Yom Kippur in Prague. It's still read every Yom Kippur. And to the right, you see the view on the old cemetery. And here, when I visit the past of Jewish history, I always want to recite the names I know aloud, just so they know when they're not forgotten. And here I wanted to make sure you see them too. They all on this old Prague cemetery. David Gans, he was famous mathematician, historian, astronomer, often asked to come to the palace of Rudolf II and discuss with him astronomy. On the top right, it's Jacob Bashevi, financier, was the first to be knighted, first Jew to be knighted under the Habsburgs. And on the bottom left, very famous Jewish leader, Mordechai Maisel. He became a millionaire. He became the first philanthropist in Jewish history of Prague. And he was a court Jew to the Emperor Rudolf II. He greatly contributed to the prosperity of Prague ghetto, built synagogues, built Jewish town hall, the hospitals. And here on the right, you see the tomb of Rabbi Yehuda Loivsgrad, who was called the Maharal, the Great One. According to Prague legend, he is the one who built Golem. And here you can see golems, and they're sold all over Jewish quarter in Prague. It's Jewish legend's favorite monster. Golem actually is a clay creature that has been magically brought to life. And in Hebrew, I was told, I don't know Hebrew, but I was told that golem means something incomplete, unfinished, like kind of like an embryo. And you see, Jewish mystics considered that it's possible in the rarest of rare circumstances, the great rabbis can bring soul to lifeless matter. And when we played magicians, when we were little children, would say abracadabra and something should be happening. We had no idea that the word abracadabra actually comes from Aramaic. I create as I speak. So the mystics believed that if you know how to use this magical formula put forth in the book of creation, you can do that. Just like God speaks and creates, so too can the mystic. So the golem was built, according to the legend, by Rabbi Loev, or by the Maharal, and Golem became a great defender of Jews in a time of trouble. And there are many times of trouble, but then Golem grew increasingly violent and fearsome. And so the rabbi was forced to take soul out of him, to break him apart, but He didn't throw the leftovers of Golem away. He hid it in the old new synagogue. And any real person of Prague, Jewish or not, they will tell you that Golem is still there, waiting for his hour to come out. And if you don't believe me, look at this photo. It's a rear wall of the oldest synagogue, continuously used synagogue in Europe, of old and used synagogue. And just, can you see the staircase? What do you think the staircase for? If not for somebody to go up and get to the Golem. There are some curious facts that I wanted to list for you about this famous rabbi, the Baharal. It is believed that his birth saved the Jews from blood libel pogrom, because his wife, Pearl, she, by the way, was a great Talmudic scholar in her own right, studying Talmud with her husband, answering all his letters. So she had a very difficult birth. So many people rushed to find a doctor. And there was a man who secretly brought a corpse of a baby that he made look very terrible. He wanted to leave it by the synagogue and then spread the rumor. And it was time of Passover that Jews killed the baby once again to make matzah out of his blood. But when he saw the crowd running, he decided it's better he runs as well. And the rabbi himself never thought that to create the Golem was such a big deal. He just was lucky. He knew Kabbalah and he was able to do it for his people. He also, I find it very interesting, he saw the exodus from Egypt is a divine paradigm shift. How come? He understood expulsion, exile as unnatural situation. So he taught that God took his people out of Egypt to give them the gift of freedom, to wire this notion of freedom into their psyche. So a new man was born after the Exodus, the new man who would always want freedom from oppression. And this is Old New Synagogue, 1270. And it's the oldest continuously used synagogue in Europe. So it was one of the synagogues that Kafka and his father attended. It also was a new, the only synagogue and the first one that had two-nave design. And you can see it right here. Again, another of charming and strange Prague legends that this synagogue actually was not built in the 13th century, but was built 2,000 years ago, right after the destruction of Jerusalem temple. And huge blocks of this broken by Romans temple were brought to Prague by angels. And now it's an active synagogue, Orthodox synagogue. Another synagogue that you will visit during your visit to Joseph of Maisel, named after this famous financier, and on the land granted to Jews by Rudolf II. During the war, when the Nazis stole Jewish treasures and religious treasures, they kept it in this synagogue as well. Right now, it's a museum, and they have a permanent exhibit going on, the history of the Jews of Bohemia and Moravia from the 10th century through the 19th. And this is the active synagogue. Spanish synagogue was built in 1868, and it's, as its name suggests, it's built in a style which is Moorish revival style, inspired in part by Arabic period of Spanish history. And it was closed during the Soviet communist domination and only reopened and restored after the Velvet Revolution. And the newest synagogue in Josephov is Jerusalem or Jubilee Synagogue. for 50th Jubilee of favorite emperor, favored by the Jews, Franz Joseph I. It was built 1905. And it's just a paradise for the architectural lovers. Nowhere else you can see this wonderful union of Art Nouveau and Moorish Revival architecture. I think it's done so well. Jewish Town Hall, remember Maisel, he built that. And it's in a Rococo, then a quiet style, then a quiet neoclassical facade. It's famous for its clock. Look at the top, you can see clock with Roman numerals, and underneath the clock with Hebrew numerals, which are Hebrew letters, and this is a clock that goes counterclockwise. The hands of the clock are switched around, and the short one shows minutes, while the long one points at hours. And now we're at the point when we can start looking, seeking Kafka in Prague and Prague in Kafka. It's two different entities to understand and to navigate. And for us, for Alex and I, finding Kafka in Prague was a personal journey of discovery. And how would you find Kafka in Prague? Prague or Bohemia or Moravia or any Czech specific place never mentioned in Kafka. He is the greatest obscurer in modern literature. He never gives us direct description of the famous Prague landmarks. Instead, we have this dispersed, transformed fragments of reality in the strangest of circumstances. Kafka had love-hate relationship with Prague. Prague won't let us go. This little mother had claws, he wrote in his letters. But his closest friends understood it differently. Like Johannes Urzidil in his book, There Goes Kafka, he wrote, and yet Kafka was Prague and Prague was Kafka. And we, his friends, knew that Prague permitted all of Kafka's writings in the most refined, minuscule quantities. Kafka influenced and determined everything, Prague influenced everything that Kafka was as an artist and the man. He felt that this city forced him to live, as he called, double anathema of double life. And he meant he's been a writer by night. And he often said that God does not want me to write, I think, but I have no choice. Writer by night and lawyer by day. Prague was where Kafka felt condemned to suffer and his insecure and futile existence. He always associated Prague with all his anxieties. So how would we find this Prague of Kafka? Shall we follow his biographical facts and topographical facts of his city? And Alex and I found that probably the best starting point should be the end as the beginning. Kafka family plot, Kafka's grave. Kafka never escaped Prague, though he died on June 3rd, 1924 in Vienna tuberculosis sanatorium. He died from tuberculosis 1 month short of his 41st birthday. His remains were brought to Prague, and he was buried in the Jewish section of the new cemetery. His father joined him in 1931, and Mother Julia a few years later, 1934. So this monument done in Czech Cubist style has all their names. The small marble plate lists the names of his three sisters. All three perished in the Holocaust and Auschwitz. On the wall opposite the grave, a simple plaque that recalls Kafka's lifelong friend, Max Brod. Why? Kafka's dying wish was, and he was very insistent on that, to burn everything he wrote. He didn't want anything to be published. He didn't want anything left. But luckily for us, Max Brod published everything he could find, letters, stories, novels, and he wrote full biography of Kafka. Brod left Prague. He was able to escape with the last train, and he came to Jerusalem, and he lived in Tel Aviv, and he is the one who made Kafka known to the world. This is view in Prague from the old town hall clock tower. As I already mentioned, we find very little of what might be called Prague prose in his writing, but we have to try. And the best way to do it is to follow Kafka's steps, to follow his life. And I wanted to share with you what he said, that he cannot live in Prague. It's always his love-hate relationship. I do not know if I can live anywhere else, but that I cannot live there, that's the least doubtful thing I know. The house where Kafka was born burned down, but so the house, which is the buildings that there, has this memorial plaque. And the small square in front is named after Kafka. But of course, during the Soviet domination, Kafka's works were pushed underground. Nobody mentioned him. But after Prague Spring of 1968, this memorial plaque was placed with his bust there. And after Velvet Revolution, Kafka suddenly became the most favorite son of Czech Republic, a martyr, a saint, and the biggest tourist attraction, though hardly any guidebook published in the United States mentions his name. Kafka's parents lived in the house where he was born less than a year, and then they moved to this House of the Minute. Look at the beautiful Renaissance frescoes on the wall. And from this house, little Franz used to walk to his elementary school. And being Kafka, he described his early school years as horror. He considered Old Town his little confined circle. That's where he lived. So we followed the circle, trying to see it through the eyes of Kafka. There was Baroque Church of St. Nicholas, one of the most beautiful Baroque I think, in the Kingdom of Bohemia. And here is Teen Church. When Kafka talked to his friend and Hebrew teacher, Frederick Tierberger, he said that just look at it. They were looking at the same place where we're looking now, the Old Town Square. Here was my secondary school, over there my university, a little further to the left my office. My whole life is confined within this small circle. And this old town hall with a famous clock, and on the right is Teen Church. It's one of the beloved churches in Prague, and was built at the end of the 14th century. The clock is famous all over Europe, and it's probably the largest clock and the most complicated and sophisticated clock. It has a mechanism that allows the performance of happen every hour on an hour, almost the whole day. And 12 apostles coming in and out of these two windows that you can see, I know. at the end, when every one of the apostles saw the light of the day, the golden rooster would tell you that performance is over, you should come next hour. There are also 4 figures underneath the dial, and 3 of them represent human sins like greed or vanity or lust, and the 4th one is a skeleton, it's death. The skeleton announced death by ringing the bell, and the other figures, they go like, no, 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 and I think it's last-ditch effort to avoid the dreadful end to their sinful lives. But you can see the typical anti-Semitic depiction of a Jewish moneylender as a symbol of vice and avarice. And he threatens with his rod all the good people, and he shakes his bag with coins. In the middle of the old town square is the monument to the greatest hero of Czech people. He was the greatest hero for over 600 years, Jan Hus. He was a university professor and a preacher, and he predated the Protestant Reformation by a century and was burned at this square at the stake for his heresy. This monument was dedicated in 1915 to commemorate 500 years anniversary since his death. Kafka witnessed this commemoration, and I think he was amused by the strangest of circumstances, maybe like Kafkaesque neighbors. The greatest of Protestants was face to face with the most beloved monument of Catholic faith, St. Mary column that was placed in the square right by where 300 years later would be the monument to Jan Hus was placed as a symbol of counter-reformation. But you won't see it now, because in 1918, an anti-Catholic or anti-Habsburg demonstration, mob pulled the column down, and it's humbly hiding behind the tin church. Kafka's wall, that's the Kinsky Palace in the old town, the Rococo Palace, that's where Kafka went to his secondary school. And his experience there was much better than in elementary school, because he met his lifelong friends like Max Brod. A few years later, after Kafka's graduation, his father moved his successful haberdashery business there. That's from Kafka's parents. And the windows, it's Czech bookstore right now there. That's where his father's business used to be. Kafka's intellectual universe continues in Old Town. This building called the Unicorn House. And this is where highly assimilated intellectual from Vienna, Berta Fanta, turned her house into famous cultural center of Prague, beloved cultural center. Her salon was very famous. Often when Albert Einstein was in Prague, he would visit it there. And this is where philosophy and mysticism and poetry and literature were discussed. Kafka was frequent, if silent, listener. He came there regularly, almost every week, with his friends Max Brod and Hugo Bergman. There was also Martin Buber, a famous Austrian and Israeli, then becoming Israeli philosopher and first editor, first publisher of Kafka's works. Continuing intellectual universe of Kafka, Charles University, one of the oldest universities in Europe, founded by Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor. And on the right, you can see a photo of Carolinian, the School of Law. That's the oldest building, one of the oldest university. Remember, according to familial laws, there were many restrictions, like the only one son of Jewish family would be able to marry. This law really was canceled, abolished in 1849. But at Kafka's time, the other restriction remained that Jewish men who wanted to have a career in civil servants but did not want to convert had only two professions open to him, and it was law or medicine. Kafka hated both equally, but his father pushed him into law, and he graduated with distinction in 1906, but compared his legal studies to being fed with sawdust that had already been chewed by thousands of mouths. And another important point in a building in Kafka's intellectual universe. If you remember Milos Forman's movie Amadeus, all scenes of Mozart in Prague were filmed there. This estate theater, where in 1787, Don Giovanni opera was premiered. It was here in Prague, and Mozart conducted. Mozart returned a couple of other times, and in September of 1791, he conducted his opera, The Clemency of Titus. He died 3 months to the day after conducting in the State Theater, died in Vienna. So it's the only theater still standing where Mozart performed during, where Mozart worked during his lifetime and conducted. In addition to being a seedbed for Kafka's many exiles, Prague also manifested an interesting geographical historic trajectory. At his birth, he was a subject of Kingdom of Bohemia as part of Austro-Hungarian Empire. But by the end of World War I, when first Czechoslovak Republic was formed, he became a citizen of the free Czechoslovakia. And yes, German is my native language, he always said, but Czech is far more endearing. Now we will leave the old town and come to new town. The Powder Tower, built in the 14th century, when Charles IV redesigned Prague entirely and was the center of the marketplace, Powder Tower separates old town and the new town. And this is where Kafka used to meet his friend, Max Brod. And New Town was center of theaters, discussion societies, it was a cafe society, it was an intellectual center. And even though Kafka was deeply unhappy by being a lawyer by day and writer at night, he hated the bureaucrat during the day. It was not just an obstacle, it was his enemy. But he enjoyed everything New Town had to offer. If one evening he wrote, my writing has gone well, the next day in the office I burn with impatience, can't get anything done. This to and fro is getting worse and worse, unhappiness that refuses to leave me. True hell is here in the office. That's what he used to say. And here is a, you can see Arco cafes. That was a favorite of Prague intellectuals, including Kafka and his friends. Multiple theaters and cafes for intellectuals and discussion societies all were centered in or around Wenceslas Square, named after Czech's favorite king and saint. And this square always was in the center of Czech life. In 1939, Nazi tanks rolled to the square to signify the conquest of the young 21-year-old Czechoslovak Republic. In 1968, during Prague Spring, Soviet tanks rolled into the square. And on the square, you can see a small memorial dedicated to 2 men who burned themselves to death to protest communist oppression. On the square is a beautiful Czech Art Nouveau style hotel in Prague. And then 1912, Kafka read from his story that never was published during his lifetime, The Judgment. So it's interesting that in this story, the conflict between the son and his father ends with father sentencing his son to death. So son jumps to the river from the bridge. Was it Karlov Most, the Charles Bridge, or maybe it wasn't. And he yells, "Dear parents, I still love you." Typical Kafka. Across from Europa is Lucerna, it's a beautiful Art Nouveau building where Kafka and his friends enjoyed cabaret performances and movies, sometimes few times a week. And there is a state opera house. It was called the New German Theater. And as a passionate theater buff, Kafka saw numerous German plays there. And now we come into the place that we always considered to be the place and space to start understanding the impact of Kafka's loved and hated city on his life and on his work. The Cathedral Quarter, or the castle, it's one of the biggest in the world. It's domineering, it's intimidating, and I always thought that the castle novel means the Castle Quarter right here. The Golden Lane, one of the oldest streets in old Prague. That's where medieval goldsmiths or alchemists used to live. Kafka's sister, his beloved sister, his soulmate, Otla, bought house, the Blue House number 22, and it served as Kafka's retreat. He loved to come there and write. He wrote The Castle there. He was working on the trial in this house. And in spite of the crowds, this is where Alex and I felt this ancient corner of Prague full of mystery and mysticism. You just separate your mind from the crowds. And you start with thinking about Kafka's stories, and you may find, just like we did, sinking deeper and deeper into his universe. Now it's Kafka's bookstore on the Golden Lane. St. Vitus Cathedral in the Castle Quarter. Many researchers think that part of the book, The Trial, takes place in this oldest cathedral. Was first church was built there in the 9th century. And as always in trial, no specific places ever matters. But remember, when Joseph K. gets arrested, but still he's let to live, to go anywhere he wants. And he spends his life crisscrossing the cities that, for me, always Prague, going across the river. He brings a visitor to the unnamed cathedral. And this is where they met with the priest who tells them the parable before the law. For Kafka, law was the physical place, close to people by some arbitrary, unseen bureaucracy. And I believe that Prague landmarks illuminate the inner truth of all Kafka stories. It's fear, it's pain, it's always guilt. And the novel ends with middle of the night execution of Joseph K. in some old stone quarry. And many believe that it's quarry that used to be in Cathedral Quarter. And the character himself comes to believe in his own guilt, because guilt is never to be doubted, as Kafka says in the Penal Colony. And this is inside the St. Vitus Cathedral, and more basilicas in the Cathedral Quarter. And now at the end, we have to visit important question about Kafka's Jewish identity. What I have in common, he once wrote, with Jews, I have hardly anything in common with myself. You see, Kafka's identification with his Jewish heritage was very complex, and Jews conspicuously absent from all of his writings, but not from his letters. He talked about it. He had passionate interest in studying Hebrew and studying Yiddish and Zionism. He took great interest in Eastern European Jewish refugees that were coming to Prague after end of World War I. And he made plans to immigrate to what was called Palestine at that time in the company of different Jewish women that he'd been dating. He was the worst boyfriend ever. He would engage with a woman and disengage, engage again, and then he would fall in love with another one, and most of his love relationships were, luckily for us, in writing letters, many of which were never sent. If Kafka had not been born in Prague and raised there the Jew, would he ever become Kafka? And I'm convinced that if James Joyce would be born in Soviet little city like Voronezh, would he ever become James Joyce and write the portrait of an artist as a young man? So that's being a Jew born in Prague is highly important to who Kafka was. And of course, there is no mention about Jews or Judaism in his writing. In any particular day, Kafka could be Czech or German or Austrian or Jew. It was an interesting synthesis of this intellectual synthesis of Czech, Jewish, German, Austrian intellectual universe. Everything is blended together. And so Kafka's father came from the South Bohemian ghetto, from the poverty. His father was impoverished kosher butcher. Hermann Kafka escaped his poverty, hated his past. He came to Prague to get somewhere in life, and he became very successful very soon. And in Kafka's family was really not observant, minimally observant, German-speaking Jews. And in fact, both of them represented typical, well-to-do, bourgeoisie, self-made family that they frantically wanted to become economically successful, and they were. And for them, it meant socially successful, which they were not. He strenuously tried to assimilate, and they felt they assimilated into larger society, and they were not. So in many respects, that was deceptive reality of stability, of financial success, of integration that really had very shaky foundation. And as for Franz Kafka, friends always thought that him being a shy, very introverted child, he somehow felt, maybe not consciously, this dramatic split between what they thought it was, safe, successful life, and what it was in reality, that menace, next pogrom was just around the corner. In his early article, essay, Kafka wrote, "Why is everything so badly built that high houses collapse every now and then for no apparent reason?" He also blamed his father. It's always very convenient to blame your parents for turning Judaism into, as Kafka said, mere trifle, a joke. You went to the temple 4 days a year where you were closer to the indifferent than to those who took it seriously. Actually, the Kafkas worshipped or attended rather two synagogues. It was Old New Synagogue and Pinkas Synagogue. Kafka's interest towards his roots was sparked in 1912, when he just by chance happened to see the performance of the impoverished Yiddish theater that came from Poland. Kafka became close friend of the leading actor, Itzhak Lowy, and he took up the cause of Yiddish culture with great passion. He organized in Jewish town hall, remember Hebrew Clock? This is where 1912, he organized a lecture and performance by Lowy, and himself made a passionate introduction, passionate lecture about Yiddish language and Yiddish culture. And 30 years after 1912, Itzhak Lowy was murdered in Auschwitz. Kafka began learning Hebrew about the same time. He learned Hebrew and Yiddish and began talking and writing about Zionism. What wanted to come to the end, and we're very close to the end, come to the end by where our discussion of Kafka's place in the Jewish culture. Is he realistic surrealist, or is he secular Kabbalist, or he Jewish mystic between religion and nihilism? And instead of you taking my word for it, I would rather quote four great minds of the 20th century, Max Brod as his closest friend, who saw Kafka's fiction in an entirely spiritual light. He wrote, "Perhaps there have been men deeper or less questioning faith than Kafka's. But what I know is the unique fact that Kafka, of all religious people, of all believers, he was the freest from all illusions. And among those who see the world as it is, without any illusions, he was the most unshakable believer." Gershom Scholem, who is considered the greatest philosopher and actually founder of contemporary academic studies of Jewish Kabbalah, he often said that when he immigrated, he was from Germany, from Munich originally. He managed to immigrate to Palestine. He became a famous professor in the University of Jerusalem. And he often said that what he read, he reread, were three works: Hebrew Bible, the Zohar, Kabbalah, and the collection of works by Kafka, because in these three collections, he expressed, there are 3,000 years of the spirit of Judaism. He claimed that he returned to Germany, and he did return in 1970s to receive the highest literary award. He claimed he is coming there to reclaim Kafka for the Jews. And our exploration of Kafka in Prague and Kafka ended in one of the best conceptual museums we ever visited, Kafka Museum in Prague. You see the city of K. The exhibition was first designed and shown in Madrid, and then it came to the Jewish Museum in New York on Fifth Avenue in 2005, and after that moved to its true home, to Prague. Exhibition consists of existential space that presents Kafka's life and the influence of the environment he lived in on Kafka, and imaginary topography, and it's a Prague in Kafka's writing. And they right at the entrance of the museum, you see this curious sculpture. It's called the Pissing Man, and it's amuses public in front of the museum because these two guys, they pee with the purpose. We never tried it, but you actually, and there is a instructions how to do it. You actually can type by phone what you want them to pee. You see, they stay in a basin that resembles outline of Czechoslovakia, of Czech Republic, but we never tried that, but it was quite amusing. I was still wired, in Kafka's mind, and I thought maybe it's postmodern absurdist allusion to Kafka-like flash tattooing machine in the penal colony. And our friend, the chief curator of the museum, Mr. Tomasz Kasiczka, he told me, "Irene, relax your Kafkaesque grip. This statue was placed by David Chorny, famous and controversial sculptor in Prague, a few years before museum was even thought of." So Kafka was laughing at me. 80 years after his death, Kafka finally got his statue in the city he loved to hate. And this Kafka in Prague, it always makes you smile. Another David Chorny statue was in 2014 was placed in front of the largest shopping mall. It's called the Head of Kafka. It consists of 42 mobile tires of 11-meter tall sculpture. It's actually 36 feet tall sculpture, 39-ton bust. And this is round thingies. They move around until it's like a Lego they put together as a bust of Kafka. So it's constantly in movement. I found it quite amusing. When we were in Prague, this statue of Kafka's ghost, bronze statue of a man standing on his knees. It was near the Golden Lane. Now it's in the convent of St. Agnes, part of the National Gallery. And it's actually was inspired, it's again, Yaroslav Rona. It was inspired by unpublished short story by Kafka by Bucket Rider. of a dying man who needed coal during the cold winter like we have now. He comes to the merchant house, but refused to get this coal, so he dies. So say, here he is here. We found Kafka's twists all over Kafka's city, like Solomon houses. There are two of them, and one is the Museum of Medieval Torture Instruments on the left, and on the right, another Solomon house that is a glad kosher cafe. As W.H. Auden said, 1941, Auden, American-British poet, had one to name the artist who comes nearest to bearing the same kind of relation to our age that Dante, Shakespeare, and Goethe bore to theirs. Kafka is the first one would think of. And I just can't let you go without quick run through the beautiful, beautiful Prague. Art Nouveau in Prague is like nowhere else. It's the best place to admire it, every detail. And Museum of Alphonse Mucha, one of the greatest artists of this period. When new museum in New York was opened a few years ago, their first exhibit was Alphonse Mucha, posters of Sarah Bernard. Cubism in Prague, again, like nowhere else. It's incredible architecture. And look at these dancing houses. Somebody might say Kafka, yes, it's Frank Gehry with Czech Vlada Milnik. And on this slide, you can see the buildings that soon to be finished would be the tallest building in Czech Republic, and David Chorny, the sculptor, is involved. Of course, it's called the Shipwreck Skyscraper, and it looks like shipwreck. So what I would like you to leave this long lecture with, to remember what we learn from the Czech Jewish narrative and the works of Franz Kafka. First, the national identity of the Jews of Bohemia, and I take the quote from the book that I like from manuscript. What places Czech Jewish history apart from a number of other European Jewish narratives is the complexity and fluidity of identities of the Jews of Bohemia that led to emergence of the new Central and Eastern European phenomenon, a secular Jew. And now to Kafka. From Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, venerated Jewish mystic writer who had very strong influence on Kafka. Every story has something that is concealed. What is concealed is the hidden light. And from the essence of Kafka, by Frederick Karl, whom I already quote to you, Prague was never only Prague. It was a moment in European and Austro-Hungarian histories. Kafka felt depicted an approaching historical development of the most disastrous kind. He absorbed the whole historical lesson before most people realized it was a historical lesson. A great writer does this. And thank you very, very much. And if we won't have time to answer all your questions, please do stay in touch. I will show you in my next slide my email, write to me, and often conversations continues for weeks. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being so patient.
All right, so we did a question in the chat already, and I would encourage everyone, if you want to type your question up, to go ahead. Lily M asked, this is about in the half-hour mark, after the Prague Spring or Velvet Revolution, who restored the synagogues in the Jewish quarter, the government or Jewish organizations?
From what I know, it was a combination of both. There were a lot of private money coming in from United States, from Israel, from local European foundations, but it was the governments and wanted to resurrect the golden age of Prague. And you can read the essay on Kafka in my book here in the slide, The Downbeat Jewish and Other Stories, and my latest book on Malta and Corsica there.